So in thinking about how I became the person that I am today, how these identities were shaped, I think some of the identities feel like they've been there for a long time, but really they came into place as a young adult, probably in my undergraduate years. When I was growing up, I grew up in San Antonio, as I mentioned, which is predominantly Mexican and Mexican-American. Pretty much my school was about 99% Latino, Mexican, Mexican-American. But no one really talked about that being a sense of pride or that being a sense of belonging. Really, it was, so a lot of people felt shame for being Mexican or for speaking Spanish. So even though we all were predominantly Mexican-American, there was rarely any people talking about how that was something that was a rich, cultural, heritage. It wasn't until I went to the East Coast, to Jersey, basically to Princeton, to study, that I realized that, one, I was so different from the rest of the world or the rest of the country, and then two, that I had basically been shamed into not really identifying with that culture. So it wasn't until I met people who were from LA and Mexico, who were very proud of being Mexican and very proud of being, Mexican American or Chicano, Chicana, that I started to say, oh, what was that process? How did that happen to me? That I went to school in a predominantly Latino area or Mexican area, and yet this was something that I had not kind of connected to. So I started to take classes. And a professor was teaching a class called Latinos in the U.S., and he was an anthropologist. And I realized, that there was all this discrimination basically against Mexican Americans in the U.S. And I started to connect like the dark skin kind of complex, how in my family being light skinned was often valued more so than dark skin. How, in my family people use the word mojao, wetback, very often to identify people from Mexico. How we were encouraged not to, date or marry Mexicans, because there was a fear amongst my family that they would be using you for citizenship, right? And so there was all this internalized hatred that I had, inherited from my family and really not being critical of. And so it wasn't until I took this class that I said, oh my God, it was kind of like a slap across the face, like, I've been taught to hate myself. I've been taught to hate my culture, to be ashamed of my language, etc. And so, almost like a whirlwind, I said, I'm going to shift this, and I'm going to learn everything I can about being Mexicana, Chicana, Latina, etc. And one of the ways that I did that, because at Princeton, they didn't have Latino studies program, they had Latin American studies, and they had African American studies. And the African American Studies program was probably the most powerful, or the most important program in the country, because we had people like Cornel West, Nell Painter, people like Toni Morrison, who were, leading African American intellectuals in the nation. And again, they were at my fingertips. So without even knowing who they were at the time, I just, I went into their classes, started reading their books, and just, my whole life changed. My racial consciousness grew, my class consciousness started to develop, and I started to talk about this stuff with my family and reclaim our heritage, our identity, our language. And so it was a really important piece of how I came to be the person that I am today, right? Because I very much focus on teaching people about themselves, about their identity, reclaiming pieces of ourselves that we've learned to hate, and not being ashamed of who we are. And so that can be through race, it can be through class, gender, sexuality. And interestingly enough, it wasn't until I left Princeton and went to UCLA for graduate school that the gender and sexuality pieces started to grow. So that was where basically I became involved in an organization called Raza Women, and these were Chicana Latina feminists. A lot of them were either queer identified or queer friendly, and they were the ones who really developed my consciousness in terms of the queer identities and queer activism, labor activism, immigrant rights activism. So even though early on in undergrad I was already kind of developing a connection to Latino identity, a pride in who I was, the activism, the actual activism really flourished in California, which it was funny because when I was in the East Coast, everyone kept telling me, because they knew I was really active in student organizations and I was involved at that level, but it was still, it's a different flavor in these elite, institutions. Activism, I think, looks very differently. Most of it looks like survival, right? Survival in a white elite institution, but everybody kept telling me, if you want to, be involved more with community activism, want to be more kind of integrated at the grassroots level, you should go to the West Coast. And that was definitely something that I did. I went to LA and I got really involved in these organizations, and in multiple struggles that, again, just lifted my consciousness to another level, and helped me become the person that I am today in that respect.